Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to episode 1 of the Culture Study podcast. So, this is just a reminder that you can get reminders for each week's episodes and show notes and prompts for our great discussion threads and a lot more by going to culturestudypod.substack.com. That's also where you can become a paid subscriber. It's a really tough world out there for podcasts right now, but subscribers like you make it possible for us to make this show as weird and nerdy and interesting as we want. And it pays, for all of the editing and production, all of the stuff that goes into this show. If you'd rather just listen in your podcast app, that's amazing. Make sure to follow the pod so that you get new episodes in your feed. And it's also so helpful, if you rate and review the show. All right, enough of that. Let's do episode 2.
I feel like a lot of people have written about infrastructure, and a disproportionate number of them have been white men who live in North Carolina, and who just don't see it in the same way. They don't sort of focus on it the same way as I do. So it's like, obviously, I think it's a thing that is of broad interest, but I think we have been trained to think of it as, it's just the engineers, the technologists, the city
planners,
the nerds.
Anyone with an MA in urban studies, like that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But at the same time, we understand that it's political too, right? Like, we're outraged when we hear about Flint. We say things like, well, those, they're Americans. Like, how could they possibly be treated that way? So we totally understand that aspect of it. And it's just thinking about how to put those pieces together.
I'm Anne Helen Peterson, and this is the Culture Study Podcast.
I'm Deb Chachra. I am a professor of engineering at a small engineering college outside Boston, and I am the author of How Infrastructure Works Inside the Systems That Shape Our World.
Tell us about your new book.
Yes, it's actually my only book. The book is called How Infrastructure Works, and in the US, the subtitle is Inside the Systems That Shape Our World. And I'm really delighted to get a chance to talk about it here.
So when I said we were doing an episode about infrastructure, and we already had this plan to have you on, but it wasn't public that you were going to be the co-host. I'm not kidding you. A dozen people either DM'd me or wrote into the questions to suggest that we have you on. So I just love that that is so legible, that you are the person that culture study readers and listeners want to hear from when it comes to infrastructure.
I mean, that is truly delightful. And I think I know, a part of the reason why, and it really is because the sort of the familiar perspective on infrastructure is not one that really intersects with the culture study audience.
Yeah.
If we think of it as it's technological, if we think about it, it's it's for the nerds. And of course, I don't believe that. And there's many ways in which I think it really speaks to the people who listen to culture study.
So the other thing that absolutely jumped out at me when I was beginning your book is the story that you use about Wile E. Coyote to illustrate the connection between infrastructure and what we take for granted and culture, just broadly. So can you tell us that story?
So the example I use is a sort of classic Wile E. Coyote runs off a cliff, looks around, and only then does he fall. And of course, gravity is inevitable, but where we are as a society isn't. So we have built these systems that make our lives as we know them possible. And we also know that there's significant sort of cost to these systems. And the big one is that all of the energy that we use to make our daily lives possible, a significant fraction of that comes from fossil fuels. And we are starting to live with the impacts of putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. A secondary element is all of the actual stuff in our lives comes from somewhere, and we're dealing with the impact of that sort of extraction and disposal part. So Wile E. Coyote looks around, realizes there's a problem, and then he falls. And the thing I say in the book, and I'm going to reiterate, is that we don't have to fall, right? There's nothing inevitable about what happens next. I think this is a really important point because we've really been fed the narrative that climate change and broadly the environmental depredation of our planet is a bad thing that is happening, and our job is to stop that bad thing. But also, it's before it's too late. And I can't tell you how much I've sort of pushed back against that sort of catastrophic framing of how to think of the impact of climate change. There is no too late. every step that we take to try to address and change these things will, in fact, have an impact, right? It's not an all or nothing proposition. It's not a do it now or it never happens proposition. It's just going to be the work for a while. But the second thing that I really want to get across is that we really get this narrative of our job is to keep bad things from happening. And I actually submit that that's actually no longer the case. The thing that has changed in the last few decades is that, and I think, a lot of people kind of know this intellectually, and we're still playing out the actual practical consequences of it. That if we now have the technology, we do now have the technology to switch to renewable energy. And that kind of changes everything in the sense of we no longer have to accept the harms that come, the global harms that come with using fossil fuels, but we can keep all of the good things that energy makes possible in our lives, right? That we don't have to reduce our ability to do things in the world, but we do have to figure out how we're going to do it. And because most of the ways in which we use fossil fuels and most of the ways we use energy, and in fact, most of the ways we interact in the world, no matter how much it feels like we're doing it as individuals, we are doing it through our collective infrastructural systems. And that means if we're going to transform them, we need to learn how to transform them together.
And I think to see these systems around us, and this is the part that I also really loved, is you said that like if culture is everything that is around us that we don't even really see on a daily basis, it's just like the way that we live, the things that we like, how we navigate the world. Like infrastructure is also that oftentimes until it fails.
If you travel outside the US or even within the US or within North America, we see this, right? That these are the systems that are the culture that we just do things this way. And then we go somewhere else and it's like, holy crap, the plugs are different, right? That's the most sort of common and familiar example. And
how dare they, right? Instead of like, oh, it's totally random that plugs are the way that they are.
Yeah, it's a local standard. So it's just like any other cultural differences. We largely notice our infrastructure when we go to different places.
I also love in the book how you talk about how you became an infrastructure nerd. And so much of it as a kid was having some of those differences very visible to you by living in different places for longer periods of time. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So on one hand, I was sort of born into it in two different ways. So one, my father worked for the local power utility from before when I was born. Yeah. And but the other thing is that I was born in Toronto right at the moment where they were doing the sort of intense investment into infrastructure in advance of a significant change to how immigration was handled. So my parents were part of that first wave of non-European immigration. And at the same time, there was building, bringing nuclear power plants online, investing in highways and the like. So my parents emigrated from India to Canada. So my dad did his MBA in Canada and before joining the power utility. And so like lots of immigrant kids, my family would spend summers in India. And we ended up, in fact, living there for about 6 months when I was 9. So going from a place like Canada, where I have kind of full stack, the electricity is just there all the time, the water is clean all the time, you really, really never have to think about it, to a growing city in India where we pretty much expected that there would be brownouts every afternoon, right? That when everyone's, it was a little bit early for air conditioners. It was much more common for people to have evaporative coolers and fans. But even that was enough of a draw on the power grid that everything would sort of brown out. We had running water, and this is true in many cities of the world. We only had running water for an hour a day in the morning and the evening. The quality of the water wasn't really high enough for kids with like Canadian immune systems. Yeah. And so we definitely boiled and filtered our water, the water that came out of the tap before we drank it. And so it really made visible to me at a really young age that these systems existed at all, right? It's by seeing two different ones. It's why the contrast is what made them visible to me at all. And then you can start getting into it's really different in these two places. Why is it different?
Yeah. My question to start the episode, we have a lot of other listener questions, but like part of the reason I wanted to have you on the show too is that I have become really fascinated with local infrastructure, specifically since moving to this island, because so many different parts, like being off of the municipal systems, has like made them visible and interesting in a way that they hadn't been before. Interesting, frustrating, all of the different things. So we are part of a water system, neighborhood water systems, which are, they're all over the place. I just had no idea because I'd always been hooked up to,
Right.
like municipal water.
Yeah.
And our neighborhood water system is really messed up. Like some of the pipes were just dug by 20-year-olds building trenches like 50 years ago. No one knows exactly where they are. Like you have a group of volunteers who is responsible for it. It's wild. It is so wild. And then, like, we have a generator. Lots of people on the island have generators because we do lose power. And then the most interesting thing, though, to me is the septic systems. And, millions and millions and millions of people are on septic systems, which are kind of magical. Like, how they work and how they work with the ground and all of, like, everything. It's so interesting. But then they also are a huge liability. And, like, to me, a really interesting way to think about the problem of privatized infrastructure. So I wonder if you could just talk about septic systems a little bit.
So, actually my colleague, Professor Alison Wood, is a civil engineer who actually did her PhD work on neighborhood scale septic. So we're sort of used to thinking of it as septic systems as either being individual, and then once you have a sort of a critical mass of people with their individual systems, then it's time to go to municipal wastewater treatment. Yeah. And she was investigating the sort of mid-range scale of septic systems that are neighborhood scale. It means that you can professionalize them, right? That it means that you can have someone who's responsible for them who can hold them to sort of a higher quality standard than you might be able to do by yourself, but as a not necessarily as a stepping stone to municipal wastewater, but actually as an alternative to municipal wastewater. Yeah. And so there's actually two sort of implicit ideas in there that I want to sort of pull out. So one is we have increasing standards for what we think is appropriate for us, right? Like what constitutes clean water and how we deal with our sewage has thankfully, right, even over the course of my lifetime, and I imagine yours, has gotten vastly improved. And so, the EPA was founded right around when I was born. I live in Boston, which had famously dirty river, famously dirty harbor, but not really all that unusually so. And really, over the course of my lifetime, I've seen the water supplies around where I live get cleaner and cleaner, not in fact worse and worse, because of concerted efforts to make them better. And some of that is technological, and a huge chunk of that is actually just policy commitments to do that. So, that septic question, it's kind of the microcosm version of this, is being able to say, like, oh, yeah, actually, we want to have higher standards, and we want to have those higher standards. It's challenging for people to do it as individuals, so we're gonna work on it as a community.
Yeah.
But the second interesting thing that eliminates is this idea of what I think of as sort of the scale of the problem. So we're, particularly in the US, we're really used to thinking of infrastructure as coming in two varieties. Either you're sort of homesteading, the sort of do-it-yourself, I have my grid, I have my septic system, I have my well, I provide for myself and my household. Or, as is the case of like the vast majority of Americans get their water from only a handful of water supply systems, because all the major cities, people do not get their water individually, right? If you live in any city, really, and certainly if you live in like New York or LA, that accounts for a significant fraction of the US population right there. So this sort of mesoscale neighborhood level infrastructure is a really interesting emergent idea. This idea of like, what can we do together as opposed to as individuals? So that's the sort of idea of neighborhood scale septic. There's a group in Massachusetts that's looking at neighborhood scale geothermal. So instead of having a heat pump, it's really hard to put a heat pump in, but it actually works better to do it as a neighborhood. I'm sure you've heard about microgrids, right? That having neighborhood energy generation and storage. There's local internet access, right? To creating small internet systems that then all of these systems can then connect into the larger system. So I think of it as we have kind of the do-it-yourself model and we have kind of like the large-scale model, but there really is a do-it-together mutual aid model, which as someone who lives in a place with a relatively small community that's not connected to the grid, I'm sure that is your world in a way that it's not mine because I live in the middle of a major city.
Well, I live in Washington State, which is very progressive in a lot of different ways in terms of trying to figure out some of these solutions moving forward. And some of them I actually don't think are unique to Washington State at all. I haven't looked around enough to know, but like the way that the county in particular provides grants for like regular pumping
Right.
of septic systems. Or like we had to replace ours because it was an old steel septic, probably the original, like whatever was put in when they got rid of the outhouse here in probably the 50s or 60s.
Right.
And we're close enough to the water that like you could never put in a septic system where we had like that wouldn't, but we were grandfathered in. And grandfathering, like in my mind, sometimes I'm like, oh, is that just like, I don't know, allowing people with various privileges to keep those privileges? And now I understand it as they would rather have people do it and get it done and take care of it instead of having the cost prohibition of like, oh, you need to like put in an entirely new system and pump your poop uphill in order to get it into that system. Like that would make it so they don't replace it. And then the field fails. And then there's all of these long scale effects. And so it's one of those cases where I see the government actually thinking in long term instead of short term. That is really heartening, but I don't know if most people really, unless you've dealt with septic system regulations or the county, you know, checking to make sure that you've had it inspected or pumped every 2 years, you don't know that that's happening. The same way that you don't know that regular maintenance of your the sewage treatment facility is happening.
Right. Well, yeah, it's really easy to see the sort of penalties and the punishment and when things go badly, right? It's really hard to see all of the effort made so that things go well until, of course, those efforts cease to happen or otherwise don't work out, right? So, and that's a really great example because it's this idea of figuring out what is needed by individuals or individual households that can be provided at that sort of state provision level that then protects all the people around that individual, right? That, I mean, you know, you don't have good septic for your own benefit, right? You have good septic for the benefit of everyone around you not having to deal with your poop. I mean, you not having to deal with it is sort of a side effect, but
also a bonus.
But it is protecting the water supply. It is, and it's because we have an incredibly long history of that not being true. Right?
Yes, exactly. So this is a great place to transition to listener questions. We had a ton about sidewalks. Yeah. And I think that's because it's one of those things that like immediately comes to mind that is super visible, like sidewalks and roads when it comes to infrastructure. So we're going to play 2 questions back to back.
Okay.
The first is from Jennifer, and our producer Melody is going to read it.
Sidewalks. What makes them more walkable or less so? Why do cities not invest more in helping their residents and others walk safely and comfortably?
And then we have this one from Kelly.
My town is up in arms about sidewalks and who pays to maintain them. Just outside of town, the tax-averse municipality doesn't have any sidewalks, leaving kids walking on narrow shoulders home from school, families on the side of busy roads on the way to the park, and employees trudging over drainage ditches just to get to work. It's dangerous and disheartening. I'd love to know more about the history of sidewalks, where the money comes to maintain them, put them in, and how I might advocate to add more.
All right. So where do we want to start here? Do you think maybe the history of sidewalks would be a good place to get into this?
So I'm sure it is. And that is definitely not a thing that I feel like I'm at all an expert on. I know there's a new book by Henry Graeber called, I want to say Paved Paradise, that is about the issue of cars. And how cities sort of got taken over for cars. But I do think there's sort of some broader ideas there, right? Then there's this idea of when you have things like this, who's benefiting, who's paying the costs, right? And who's being harmed. So that's kind of the first piece of it, right? And then the second piece of that is this idea of how do we see or how do we think about those benefits? And I think there's some really sort of deep human things here, right? I think humans are much better at loss aversion than we are at seeing the possibilities of new things. So, and, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is, of course, famously progressive and has had an enormous amount of reshaping of the roads over the course of the last kind of 5 to 10 years, and there's more planned. I'm unusual, I suspect, in that I am someone who commutes by car and by public transit and by bike pretty much every week.
Yeah.
And so that means I'm I'm a pedestrian most of the time. I'm also I work at a engineering college out in the suburbs. So I drive out there and, I will happily bike around the city. And if I'm working at home, I'm often working not at home, but like at a library or elsewhere, and I'll bike. So I've sort of seen this development, right? I've seen it from the point of view as a pedestrian and as a driver and as a cyclist. And I've sort of seen, even in a place like Cambridge, I've seen the sort of fights over it. And I think a chunk of it is that it is super easy to see what you're losing when you do this. And it's very, very hard to imagine what the benefits will be before they happen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is all of those benefits, and in fact, many of the harms, are not things that we can easily put a dollar value on. It's like, how do you put, I too have walked in places that had no sidewalks, and I've been walking at the side of the road because I'm used to walking places. And so, I'll be out somewhere in the suburbs and it will not occur to me that there will not be sidewalks by the side of the road and that maybe I can't comfortably walk to where I'm going. It is impossible to put a dollar value on how dangerous, how disheartening it is to be trudging along the side of the road or crossing drainage ditches. And so we don't really have a very good vocabulary to talk about that and to make decisions around that. We kind of have one metric, which is like, what is the economic cost of this, or what is the economic benefit of this? Right. And we haven't, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I think this actually applies to infrastructure broadly, right? That most of the benefits of it, and in fact, many of the harms, are not things that can be described in dollar terms. And I feel like we are learning or most likely relearning, the other way around. I'd say relearning because we built this infrastructure in the first place. But I think ultimately we are in fact learning the vocabulary for how do we articulate these benefits, these harms, and how do we negotiate with the people who live around us about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it.
Yeah, it makes me sad that I think one of the pieces of that vernacular now for communicating that is pedestrian deaths and cyclist deaths. Right. And that is not like it's either cost benefit analysis or it's taking those sorts of incredibly stark and tragic manifestations of the lack of safety that occurs when you don't have sidewalks or when you don't have good apparati for crossing the street. Right. What's the word for like along a strip mall kind of area in a suburb where you have like 4 or 6 road or like lanes, and they're called like super roads or groads or something like that. Like they're just like, there's a word
I think I know what you mean, but I
like,
I'm not. Yeah, I don't know the term of art.
And like you, I find myself like when I would be going to some random place to report, and I oftentimes go on a run in the morning, and you look at the little map and you're like, oh, I could go here, and then no, you can't. Yeah. You're in the drainage ditch, right? Yeah. Or the other way that I could always tell, almost like the politics of an area, was when I would get to a crosswalk, and is the crosswalk engineered so that it only shows the walk sign when someone presses the button? Right. Or is it engineered to actually move between the two, like acknowledging that there will always be pedestrians there? Yeah. Or is the pedestrian the exception to the rule?
Right. And actually, the one I always really noticed is when you can only cross the street on like one side. So you have to like cross over to the other side. And it's like, what the hell? Like everyone else is in a car. Like it doesn't cost them any time or energy. Right. But it costs me, I'm often, again, also out for a run. Right. It costs me time and energy to have to needlessly cross the street in order like, to cross over it or to cross back or whatever, and not to stay on my side of the road. Yeah, all of those things make it very, very clear to pedestrians that you are, in fact, second-class citizens on our shared roads, right, that we're all using.
And even something, too, like I remember reading a big piece about curb cuts in New York City and how difficult they are for people who are in mobility devices, but also for people who are pushing strollers. But that they're there for parking, right? Like they're there so that people can pull in and then block the sidewalk, and they're just like, and the preference is for the individual there. And so sometimes I think it gets to this like larger ethos, which is in some ways the contrast between like political ends of the spectrum, which is that like, do I care about things that don't benefit me personally, but will benefit people who are not like me or people who are not related to me? Or do I only care about things that personally benefit me? Do I only want to fund things that will personally benefit me? Yeah, how do you think about that?
I mean, so one of the things about infrastructure systems, so I mean, infrastructure means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but I really focused on, my background's engineering. I really focused on these technological networks, right? So this is sort of classic utility, so transportation, as we've been talking, but also like water and electricity and telecommunications, right? These sort of networks. So the thing about these as networks is that broadly, we use these to bring things to where we use them. So it could be information, it could be energy, it could be like food, it's like supplies, or it means we're moving ourselves around, right? Transportation. The thing about this is that we all have bodies that exist somewhere on the planet, right? And which seems like a really dumb thing to say, but is in fact true. And if we build out these networks, then we are in a relationship to the people who live around us in these networks, whether we know them or not, whether we have anything in common with them or not. I mean, this is the sort of truth about living in a city, is that you're in a relationship with everyone around you because of these infrastructural networks, because you have a body that is present in this city.
Yes.
So that's where the you don't really care about other people. It's like, I'm sorry, but if you're on the same network, then you have something that you share in common with the people around you. And it's actually worse than that, right? It's not even just the people who live around you. It's these networks are essentially global now, right? So we can do things in some place that affects people that we may never meet on, the other side of the country or on the other side of the planet. And we are in a relationship with those people. So, and I think of this as the idea of infrastructural citizenship, right? That we have our passport that says where you're allowed to live, but ultimately we have this deep relationship with the people who share the land on which we're currently living today, but also into the future. And so we kind of don't get to say, well, I don't really care about these other people. It's like you're in a relationship with them, whether you like it or not. And I always really like the idea of politics as what you get when you have a sustained relationship with people that you can't easily walk away from, right? That you have to decide how are you going to work together on things. It's not about, political parties. It's not about voting. It really is. It's a sustained relationship. You can't easily leave. And that is really true of where you live or where you are, right? That you don't get to get out of this relationship just because you decide you don't like your neighbors or because you want to try to live by yourself. You're on the same network. You're sharing the same space. This really is the challenge, right? It's to figure out how to work across any of those divides. Fortunately, broadly, people do actually everyone says, oh, no one cares about infrastructure. Nobody really, nobody likes the weather. And I think that is 100% not true. I think that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think everybody cares deeply about infrastructure. Many people really love infrastructure. And certainly, no matter where people sit on their sort of political divide, there is an understanding that infrastructure serves many of us well. And what we really want is to serve more of us better.
I mean, if anyone tries to say that no one cares about infrastructure, I invite them to come to any dinner, family gathering, particularly here in the West, where people talk about roundabouts,
right?
Because there's more roundabouts now, and those are a real problem. Okay, this is a good segue into talking about cars, right, which I think is another thing that people care a lot about and sometimes don't know how to extract themselves or how to affect change in this larger system. So this question comes from Vivian.
How do we undo or evolve the car-dependent country we've built? I've been thinking about this for several reasons, both societal and personal. Kids unable to experience the gleeful independence of walking to the corner store to buy a juice or candy, and the mental health crisis this has contributed to in teens. My kids can, but millions cannot. There is literally nowhere they can walk safely. A culture in which pedestrians are blamed for their own deaths. A giant car arms race leading to ever deadlier collisions. A sedentary lifestyle that many cannot escape from. Lonely seniors who are too old to drive but have no access to public transit. The fact that a major reason parents take their kids to Disney World is because it's a place their kids can walk around safely.
That is all these things. I feel it. And just to kind of get us started here, how car dependent is the United States comparative to other, where are we on the spectrum? Are we the most car dependent?
first of all, I don't know if I want to talk about the United States as a whole, as like the most, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would say that this is, I grew up outside the United States and I've spent time outside the country. And I always say that the US is 50 different countries in a trench coat, which is the thing that's
100%.
hard for, and actually it's probably more than 50. I mean, if you like Eastern West Washington and Western Washington, right, are not 100%. The same place. So, but in particular, because of the sort of distribution. So like if you live in New York City and you don't have a car and you never need a car versus large parts of the United States where that's not true. And that's true of other places too, right? That's not specific to the US. Yeah. So it absolutely, I don't know if it makes sense to say like we are the most car dependent country. Yeah. However, it is absolutely true. Two things are absolutely true. One is many of our cities can really only be navigated by car, right? That it's like significantly easier, faster, less expensive to get around by car. It might only be possible to get around by car than it is in other places. And that's particularly true when you think about intercity travel, right? That it's very, very hard to get across the United States without either driving or flying, right? Those are pretty much our options. There's not a lot of train. There's very little sort of public transit. I mean, flying is mass transit, right? It's just not public. It's privatized. Although again, we know that airlines are also have been supported in various different ways. So I think many of us understand that we live in a society, in a culture that is deeply dependent on cars. And I think many people have also realized that this was a choice, right? That this is not a thing that happened naturally. It was an actual decision that was made by many of our forebears who decided that they wanted to live in a world where people had access to, in theory, their own private, the freedom of having their private vehicle, that they could leave when they want to leave. They could come home when they want to come home. Cars are actually kind of amazing for that.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, is when you sort of build everything around that. And one of the ways I think of it is that cars do not scale, that if you have more people closer together, cars just get worse. Right? That's basically what traffic jams are. I sort of joke that I can I can go anywhere in my car at any moment as long as the thing I do not want to do is go into downtown Boston at rush hour. And in which case I will like just walk to the subway. And and that really gets across this idea that public transit scales as people get closer together. And we've sort of committed to one and not committed to the other. Mm-hmm. And in fact, have uncommitted. People talk about this in LA. It's like, oh, LA had all these streetcars. That's true of many places, right? Because that was the only option to move around before we had this sort of easy, widespread access to fossil fuels. But like, as Vivian noted, that ability to access that freedom that comes from having cars is by no means evenly distributed. And certainly, every one of us, if we're a driver, if we're like, I'm happy getting around in my car, at some point in our lives, that is going to become no longer true, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we're all going to age. We're all going to lose our capacity. There's going to be a moment where we're going to be like, I can no longer drive safely. That is also true of everyone under the age of 16. That is also true of everyone who, for whatever reasons of sort of disability or sort of non-standard ability, cannot drive safely. We already know that this approach does not serve large swathes of our population. And in fact, as I said, if you feel like you're well served by your car today, someday you will not be well served by being expected to drive everywhere. So then the question is, well, what do we do about this, right? How do we start moving over? And I think that there really has been this sort of widespread awareness that this is a thing we want to change. And one really great piece about it is that this isn't an all or nothing proposition. And particularly because we have access to things like, just-in-time transit. So I think about like public micromobility, like Los Angeles has been experimenting with sort of small scale buses that don't necessarily have fixed routes, that are kind of halfway between a bus and an Uber, which wouldn't have been possible before people had cell phones, right? There's like new possibilities for how we can create shared transit systems that didn't exist in the past. Having said that, like I'm 100% in favor of like intercity rail transport. I like the idea of I'm just going to like sit on a train and look out the window or work and not actually have to pay attention to driving the entire time. I get to do something else. But the nature of networks is that they are connected, right? So it's like if you can figure out how to make changes to your local environment, then that can happen kind of everywhere and all the time. And then those systems connect up. So
Yep.
it doesn't have to be like we're going to have a giant, this is the new thing that's happening for a lot of it on the day-to-day level. Like that's the getting your kids to school piece of it. That's not the, like, how do we connect up cities across 3,000 miles of continent answer. But they're really closely related, right? So seeing the new possibilities and thinking about how do we build out these networks.
Yeah. I see this in the Seattle light rail, which I always wondered if there was ever going to be the political will to actually do a light rail project after the disaster of the monorail project in the early 2000s.
Right.
And I love it. I love it so much. Like, it is so incredible to get down to the airport. If you're going to any sort of sporting game, like, people actually use it. And the beautiful thing is that it keeps expanding and it's going to keep expanding in so many different directions. And part of the reason they're able to muster that political will to do it is because it's working.
Right. It's a virtuous circle.
Yeah, it's not perfect. There still needs to be more. There needs to be a much better bus system that connects to it. But you got to, sometimes I think that there's a reticence to start somewhere, right? There's just this oh, we'll build it, no one will come, and it's not going to, there's a defeatism almost, instead of we got to start and then we'll keep going.
And, this is where I feel like I'm a giant nerd, because I do feel like the data is really compelling that public transit in particular is a virtuous circle, right?
Yeah.
That if you build it, that people start using it, and then it actually becomes, because public transit does scale in a way that cars don't, right? The more people who use it, the better it works. And then you can afford to invest more, you can have more, add more routes. And even if it's just we're going to have more buses, or even if we're going to have mini buses, right? If you just start somewhere, you can sort of get that flywheel going. And, some of us, you're sort of describing direct experience with this. Certainly there's a huge amount of data on this, right? About how these systems work, and that it really is a virtuous circle, right? It really is not, let's see if we can get the political will and we're going to build this. It's if you just sort of get some traction and get going on it, public transit is the thing that is genuinely sort of appreciated, used, becomes increasingly valuable as more people use it.
So our next question I am fascinated by. I had no idea this was happening. It's about rural infrastructure, and it comes from Caroline.
I live in Vermont, and my local utility has started to give some customers large Tesla home batteries as a way of preventing outages, which can be pretty common, particularly in more rural parts of the state. So people around here are pretty excited about this approach, and from what I can tell, it's relatively unique. And I'm just curious about whether this is a feasible way of dealing with outages in other parts of the country as well.
I think of this as sort of like a resilience question, right? A climate resilience question, in terms of okay, if this is something that we're going to have more of, we're going to have more power outages because you can only make a grid so sustainable to weather outages. What are we going to do so that people aren't in crisis? What do you think about this?
So I actually think that's just one piece of it. The most kind of immediate piece of it is we have these power lines, we get snowstorms, at some point this year, you're going to have a power outage. And we know that if you have batteries, it'll help you weather an outage. So natural disasters are different than extreme weather events, right? It's become a natural disaster because it interacts with despite the name, because it interacts with human systems. And most commonly, it's a natural, what the severity of a natural disaster is that our basic infrastructural systems were disrupted, and it's how long does it take for them to come back up again, right? And it could be a snow day where you can't drive, but everything else is working just fine. Or it could be you have a 2-week-long blackout, right? In the wake of, in Hurricane Maria, where some places didn't get power back for a year. Or even something like Hurricane Sandy, right? Where there's every system was disrupted. So basically starting to say, look, there's always going to be extreme weather events, but we're going to figure out how to make individual households resilient. So we'll put batteries in. But there's actually more to it than that. So the thing about having batteries is I think of batteries in the house, batteries everywhere, really, grid-scale batteries, as buffers. That right now we pretty much produce electricity on a sort of a moment-by-moment basis. That we know roughly how much energy, actually we know often quite exactly how much energy is going to be used on one hand, and we have natural gas or coal or other power plants. And, they really operate like a car, right? It's if you need more power, you put your foot on the accelerator, you put more fuel into it, you get more power out, and you can match these two things. Unfortunately, there's no equivalent of an accelerator for lots of forms of renewable energy for, for like sunshine or wind. And of course, it is possible to have, there's I want to say Dunkelflaute, the German word for dark doldrums, right? When you have a cloudy and windless day. So neither your solar nor your wind generation is really working. So instead of trying to do this like hyper optimized match demand and supply, we can instead build in buffers, right? And so giving everyone batteries is essentially putting in a grid scale energy storage network. You're building in resilience even on days that seem like perfectly fine days, right? Not emergencies, because it just means that you can smooth out the variation in supply so that everyone has access to energy that they need because there's a sort of built-in buffer. In fact, you can get even more clever. If you've heard about things like the smart grid, you can use it to sort of, if you know that a lot of people are going to use electricity in the afternoon, for example, on a hot day in the summer where everyone's running the air conditioners, you can use this battery storage to kind of arbitrage, like when are you generating energy and when are you storing it and when are you going to use it? So as these systems get smarter and they talk to each other and they talk to the utility, you can start doing all of the things that we sort of talked about doing when we have renewable energy, which is having a smart grid, really bringing to bear sensors and communication. And instead of having this sort of just-in-time grid, we can start having the system that works, that makes renewable systems really work. So yes, the immediate thing is you will keep your power when there's a snowstorm, but the actual long-term goal is we have a robust and reliable, fully renewable energy grid.
I love this. This is making me think about it so different. And it's so much better than my propane powered generator,
That's
right? Like on many different levels. But that makes so much sense. And I hope that this really answers Caroline's question. So our next one is about infrastructure that you don't necessarily see or participate in directly. This is from Kira, and Melody's going to read it as well.
Almost every wastewater treatment plant in the coastal United States is built near sea level. Most of them are aging, rusting, corroding. Is the United States going to systematically replace these plants, or are we wading, literally, into a murky new era where we are going to need new landscape systems to clean wastewater?
Well, so first of all, wastewater treatment, they are, of course, at sea level for a reason, which is that water and also waste flows downhill. And so it means that I live in Boston where there's like a single giant plant called the Deer Island Wastewater Treatment Plant that's across the harbor, like across the channel from Boston Logan, which are both built out sort of in Boston Harbor. And so, yes, there are pumping stations, but broadly, everything just, if you flush the toilet or water goes down the drain, everything just gets carried downhill. So yeah, they're typically built at the lowest point around, which is sea level. Whereas, of course, our clean water comes from the highest point around and then flows downhill. So it comes in New York City, it comes from up the Hudson River. In San Francisco, it comes from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in the Sierras and so forth. There's no getting around the fact that physical systems decay over time, right? So one way or another, we're going to have to do something to make sure that these stay up and running, right? And that means maintaining them, repairing them as they break down. It means replacing them as they need to be replaced. It also, which is, I think Kira is alluding to here, because they tend to be at sea level. If sea level rise is going to become an issue where you live, figuring out how to harden them against storm surge, hurricanes, and so forth is going to be a big issue. There's really no getting around the fact, I already alluded to the fact that because we tend to use energy through fossil fuels and through these shared systems and our infrastructural systems are powered, that means that they are the major way in which we as individuals contribute to climate change. They are also the systems that are going to be the most affected by climate change because they move things around the landscape, right? So whether it's, electricity being brought to our houses or whether it's sewage being taken away from our houses, if the landscape in which they're embedded is changing, and in a future that looks very different, the next 100 years is going to look very different than the past 100 years, no matter what we do, no matter how well we sort of mitigate climate change at this point, then it means we're all going to need to figure out how to deal with that. And we're going to need to bake that in. So one of the things I also say is that if you live in North America, and particularly if you live in the United States, if you live really anywhere in the developed North, like we are the richest civilization that has ever existed in human history, right? Like our history as a species. And no matter how you care to measure that, right? Whether it's money, and I personally think of it in terms of energy, not dollars, right?
Yeah.
Like in terms of what we can do together, our sort of level of technological sophistication, our level of agency, our ability to cooperate together. There is absolutely no reason why we cannot decide that we will build wastewater that works for us in 50 or 100 years, right? That we can build electric. Now, I do not remember this. I was too young. But like Jimmy Carter, during the height of the oil crisis, told everyone that you should turn your thermostat down and wear a sweater. And like, that's not the future, right? It used to be that if you wanted to have access to energy, it had to be through fossil fuels. That's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
So it really is the political question of how, allocating the money that we have to things that are genuinely meaningful to all of us, like adequate wastewater treatment. Like, go figure.
We have like air conditioners on the steering wheels of our cars. We have figured out how to do that. We could figure out how to update our wastewater treatment. Like there's all of these like frivolous or like wonderful things about being an incredibly smart like we're at this point in our civilization where we can do so much. Right. And we just have to make sure that we include that in the so much.
There's that standing joke about like, oh, like we were promised jetpacks in the future. It's like we actually kind of have jetpacks, right? That's what electric cars are. They're like you as an individual have access to all of this energy to like go around and like move around and do stuff. It's also kind of weird and dangerous for yourself and for the people around you. Yeah. But like we're really good at doing that at an individual level. But the future I was promised had trains. Right? Like I want
jetpacks and trains.
Yeah, like the future that I mean, utopian visions of the future, like people don't generally have jetpacks. What they generally have is like public transport, right? Yeah. And so I want that future for a bunch of reasons. And we figured out a lot of the individual technological sophistication, right? Like I think my iPhone is amazing, right? I think that electric cars and like cars generally are kind of amazing, but figuring out how to put the emphasis on the other side, right, for these collective systems is the thing that we are not very practiced at. And I think a chunk of that is actually part of the reason why I wrote this book, is to give ourselves some visibility into these systems as collective and as non-monetary, right? As having value that is not economic, as having harms that can't be measured in dollars.
Okay, I think this is a great way for us to do our last question, which I think offers us, even though it's a little bit pessimistic, a way to be optimistic. This is from Claire, and Melody's going to read it.
Is it the case that large-scale infrastructure is no longer politically viable to build? My partner and I were discussing this the other day, whether large works are somehow publicly unpalatable and politically infeasible. Are small or comparable investments in different communities necessary to move funding or projects along politically?
So the first thing I'll say in response to this is that I am so thrilled that we have a large-scale infrastructure project that is about to start on our island, which is that we are getting an electric ferry to replace our ferry that is from 1962. And it's been a huge process that has involved the community in terms of like applying for the national grants that have a lot, and we have matching dollars from the county and all of this stuff. It's going to take a long time. It's really complicated because there's eelgrass and we have to replace some of the docks to put in the electric stuff. But like, I was in Norway a couple years ago. I saw these electric ferries. They feel like the future. It is going to be fantastic. And it is a huge, large-scale infrastructure project that was made possible, not through individual politicians, but through community might. And so I wonder if that's maybe a way for us to start talking about this.
And in fact, you actually alluded to applying for grants and getting sort of support, right? So I really love, there's a developmental economist, Amartya Sen, who worked with pretty much the poorest communities on the planet, right? He worked in places like India. And he said that wealth is a way of providing us the freedom to live the kinds of lives that we have reason to value. Yeah. And one of the reasons why I love that is because on a day-to-day basis, and this became extremely clear to all of us who stayed home during the pandemic, our freedom to live the kind of lives that we have reason to value does not, in fact, come from wealth. It actually comes from shared infrastructural systems, right? That make it possible to do something other than spend our time doing that. And so, you really highlighted something there where the other key piece of this is the kind of lives that we have reason to value, right? There is no one-size-fits-all answer to that solution. So you sort of described this as we all got together, we understand like what needs to be done, we got some external funding, and that really highlights this idea that there doesn't have to be a single top-down approach, but it really is useful to basically say there is funding available, but we're not going to say this is how you need to use it. We're going to say you as a community can decide what you have reason to value. And then the all-purpose facilitator, in Sen's term of wealth, can then be allocated to you to make that possible. Doing this work well is never going to be easy, right? It is how do you balance not just the human actors who might have differing priorities, but how do you balance things like the natural effect? And you talked about the eelgrass and the sort of technological questions about the docks, right? How do you balance those types of externalities and harms? But the flip side is this sounds really dumb. These are solvable problems, right? A non-solvable problem is, do you have to violate the law of thermodynamics, right? And a solvable problem is you have to figure out how you're going to build this. So on the one hand, like though it is politically challenging to do lots of things, especially big things, politics can change. Enough people can say, we actually want to live in a different kind of world. That's how we live in a different kind of world, right? That's what politics means. That's how it happens. At no point is anything sort of taken for granted. At no point is anything a foregone conclusion. What is absurdly impossible today is our social norm tomorrow. And that's the thing that I think we're starting to see happen, right? I see that in the questions that people sent in. I see that when I look at different projects that are happening, right? And they're happening, we sort of live in the monolithic world where there's like, oh, we know what climate change is. We know like it's really hard to have cars. It's really hard to see all of these diffuse, distributed changes that are happening everywhere that are about making this better world. But those networks, those people, those diffuse, systems are growing and they're multiplying and they will connect together. And then it will go from being impossible to being inevitable.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the fairy felt impossible and now it is inevitable. That is how I feel about it. So this is a great place to end. This has been a fantastic conversation. All of your huge fans, I think, are going to be very excited. And also, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of new fans out there, too. If people want to find more from you on the internet, where can they find you?
I have a newsletter called Metafoundry. I'm Deb Chachra in various places. I think, like a lot of people, my social media is highly transitional right now.
Yep.
And more than anything, there's, how infrastructure works captures a lot of these ideas. I actually love that my friends describe it as like distilled Deb, like cask strength Deb is what one of my friends put it as. So, that's certainly the place to go for sort of deeper ideas in this. And, the book really ends with what I think of as a set of heuristics for how to think about these changes. There's no algorithm, there's no checklist, there's no right answer, but certainly there are some principles. And so that's, I think, more than anything else, what I would encourage people to engage with.
And I would say if you like this podcast, if someone listening likes this podcast, they will love the book. So please go check it out wherever you get your books.
And thank you so much for hosting me. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you and to talk to your listeners.
If you're a paid subscriber, stick around because we're about to do the AAA segment, also known as Ask Ann Anything. And this is a paid subscriber benefit. It's really fun. And this week's question is an awkward friend question. Thank you so much for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. We're getting ready to record an episode that is all about the Mean Girls trailer. Not about the movie, but the trailer for the new Mean Girls movie. We have some really good questions. There's a lot to talk about, but we need like one or two more. So if you go watch the trailer, or if you've seen it already, then go to the Google form and submit your questions so that we can answer them in this episode, which we're recording later this week. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question to our subscriber-only advice time segment, check out the show notes for a link to our Substack. If you want to support the show and get bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. Plus, you get the knowledge that you're paying for the stuff that you love. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, and you can find the show also on Instagram at Culture Study Pod. And just remember, everything is interesting.